that a material body has in virtue of being that kind of material body, as opposed to any other kind of material body.
Mm-hmm.
And that specifically when we say something like, I'll give you an example, like a perceptual state would be specifically defined in like the ability of an organism to like discriminate in its environment, right? And then we can make a distinction between perceptual and non-perceptual states as like being able to discriminate versus not being able to discriminate. And these are innately. And then the aspect where it becomes normative is that I think concepts necessarily interplay within these things called judgments, right? Which are the kind of like combination of concepts together. And then specifically when we like kind of like move concepts together into like the form of a judgment or like some type of thought or proposition, right? Those are gonna have some like normative stuff to it. Now, why is that particularly normative? Well, that's particularly normative because that's gonna like fit into our broad like conceptual sphere of like giving and supplanting reasons, right? It's gonna kind of figure into a giant like conceptual schema we have in our head, right? Now, like I can give a bunch of arguments for all these different sorts of positions, but this is just the kind of broad philosophy of mind view that I have.
So it seems to me like you're saying that mental facts, maybe facts about perception, thought, belief, are not internal private states, but are constituted partly by the relation to the world and
they're
conceptual capacities.
Yeah.
And it seems like to me you're also like invoking like an activist view. So like perception, cognition, okay, and then the normativity of the mental, like judgments and concepts are inherently normative, and they involve correctness conditions, like what counts as getting it right or wrong.
Yeah.
So what someone would say if perceptual and conceptual states are grounded in the material and biological processes, like how can normativity arise from those purely causal interactions?
So you're asking how is it the case that purely causal interactions can be normative, or how is it the case that we can reconcile our preconceived?
So they would say, yeah, sorry, like a physical discrimination, like maybe distinguishing from red or green is a causal process, but normative assessment, like maybe judging that one ought to see or think in a certain way, seems to require standards that transcend causal explanation.
Yeah, okay. And so what you're saying is like, look, normative facts, they don't particularly they don't, at least as we conceive of them, have like a strong inferential gap between. Are you there?
Could you repeat them?
Sorry. You're saying that normative facts have like some strong inferential gap between these other sets of facts, right? Like these sets of descriptive facts, right? Well, firstly, it's right for me to be skeptical that merely because that there's a strong inferential gap between facts that there's going to be a metaphysical gap. But let's assume that this inferential gap implies a metaphysical gap. Even if it does imply a metaphysical gap, if we give some like proper analysis of what I think it means for something to be normative, right, or like what normativity is constituted in, I think the problem originally like kind of disappears. Because like, look, remember to the prior signposts we like gave, right? Normativity in some way is constituted in judgment, right, which is one constituted by concepts, and concepts themselves arise from the world, right? This is I guess you can say like a complete non-issue, because part of what it means for is also to give an account of its content in the first place, right? And the account of content was given, right, by the kind of externalist picture that I was giving in the first place.
The thing about what you just said, I mean, I feel like redescribing the relation doesn't just resolve the gap; it relocates it. So if you say like that normativity, is constituted in judgment, that doesn't explain how normativity can arise merely descriptive conceptual relations. Like it only restates that judgments have normative force.
Well, no. Look,
so the question isn't whether about judgments are normative.
I like remember the story I gave about how judgment came to be, right? Judgments come to be from concepts, and concepts are externally constituted, right? They require like certain like sets of like picking out certain features in the world and etc. Right? If you're saying the point is that the story that I gave, the story that I can give on an account of meaning, also gives an account of reality, right? Unless you specifically kind of hold like a view of meaning that is contrary to mine, or like a particular view of like a non-conceptualist view of normativity, right? Like a view of normativity that is like,
I feel like what you brought up is just an account of meaning that explains reference, not rightness. So your story that you're referencing about how meaning arises, say through external relations between concepts and worldly features, which explains how words and thoughts hook onto things in the world, that tells us about what our concepts are about, but not what makes one use of a concept correct and another incorrect. Like for instance, describing how the tree is like anchored to environmental.
Yeah. So what you're saying, and
you
this
love
is like
cutting me off.
This is a picture that's given from like the original private language argument, right? So the picture that you're giving is this, right? The picture you're giving is like, look, merely because I can like ostensibly point out things in my perception, right, doesn't necessarily supply a use. And since it doesn't supply a use, it doesn't actually give the normativity needed for it to have meaning, right? Because in order for something to have meaning, it needs to have a supply use, right? Like that's the general.
Could you repeat that, because you kind of cut out for me?
Oh, sorry.
Kind of lagged out there.
So what you're saying is like, look, merely referencing a thing, right, doesn't actually supply use, right? Right, and since it doesn't supply use, it doesn't actually give us normativity in the sense that I'm talking about.
Like, for an instance, like, because I was going to give an analogy for what I'm saying, because I think you're like encapsulating what I'm fully trying to say here. Like, describing how the concept tree is anchored into an environmental stimuli or something like that, like maybe light patterns or perceptual routines or linguistic conventions. I think it just explains its content, but not its normative force, right? So you still need an account of why using a tree to describe a rock is wrong rather than merely different. Meaning the tracking by itself is descriptive and the correctness is prescriptive.
Well,
so all I was saying there,
explained by the reference, right? And what you're trying to say, what you're saying is like, why is it wrong? I think was generally supplied to what the concern that I was trying to state, that I thought you were stating, right? Which is just that merely referring to something or really giving like some offensive example of something or some demonstrating something, right, doesn't actually supply it with a use. Right, like with some rule of use.
Wait, sorry, could you repeat that?
I'll give it like this might help, right?
Yeah.
Let's say like I have like some like sense datum theory of picture of perception, right? So I'm having perceptual states, right? And there's no particular concepts, right, that are in the perceptual states. They're just like non-conceptual set of sense datum, and I want to define like a particular word, right? So let's say I'm defining the word red. And by the word red, I just mean the feeling I get when or like the sensation I get when I see the red colors, the kind of non-conceptual red here, right? The concern here that I think would be a more adequate way of like phrasing your concern is that merely like pointing at particular examples of red here, right, doesn't actually supply us with the use, right? I.e. that I should use red in this context as opposed to some other context. Right, that is the context, and this is the correct use of red as opposed to another use of red. And thus it doesn't actually have its normativity.
Yeah, so I think that's what... Yeah, so when we say that the capacity, or when I say in this case, to discriminate precedes the capacity to use, I'd say that it's true that the linguistic meanings involves rule-governed use, but the content of perceptual experience, the thisness, right, of seeing a big-ass cock or a BBC, or of seeing red, precedes and grounds that linguistic use.
Big-ass cock or BBC would be conceptual, which would be normative. So you would specifically say like bigness and then blackness and like the cock shape.
You're right. Yeah, you know a lot about that. But before we can apply or withhold the term red correctly, okay, you would say, or someone would say, we must already be able to see and distinguish red from other hues. So that pre-linguistic discriminatory capacity is not conceptual content, but it's structured, informative, and capable of conceptualization.
Yeah, so like this is like a point. It's like you're saying, like, look, we necessarily need certain prior concepts in order to be latent in perception, to even have the perceptual states in the first place, or have the intake, right? But remember what I said, right? In virtue of, remember what I said earlier, that the organisms have it in virtue of being those kinds of organisms. The explanatory story wasn't actually like cut off. And secondly, if your concern is taken any further, right, what you're inclined towards is just some skepticism about meaning in the first place, right? Because what I was saying earlier about the more proper way of formulating the concern is more about a skepticism about use as it relates to meaning, right? And then specifically, I was like, sorry. Sorry. Anyway, so like specifically, This isn't like an actual concern about whether or not, you know, my picture is normative. It's about a concern about whether or not my picture actually supplies us with meaning whatsoever.
But when you say like in virtue of being that kind of organism, I just feel like that's not an explanation, but just a restatement. So like if you say that saying that an organism has meaning or normativity in virtue of being that kind of organism doesn't actually explain how or why that's true. It just identifies the locus of the mystery. So it's like saying humans have consciousness in virtue of being conscious beings. That would be true, but it just seems vacuous.
Well, look, it's not
so to explain something is to give me a second because you said a lot of stuff here. I'm sorry. Like to explain something is to specify the mechanisms or the structures or maybe the ontological relations that makes it possible. So appealing to being that kind of organism, to me, it just seems like you're only redescribing the phenomena or like in the biological or taxonomic terms without addressing the metaphysical question, which someone could lay out and say what makes a state of an organism count as meaningful rather than merely causal. And to me, like without that bridge, that move merely asserts naturalized meaning, rather than earning it. And when you talk about the virtue of kind, to me, like, or to anyone else, that would seem kind of circular. Like, if we ask why organisms have that kind of meaningful capacities, the answer, because that's what they do, it seems like that's circular. Like the claim they have virtue of being that kind. Go ahead.
At some point, the like our description of the organism is not. I feel like it's not going to have anything explanatory besides it is just that kind of organism. Right, like we're at some point we are just kind of making a bucket list of descriptions about what the organism is, but this isn't like nullify my naturalistic story about meaning, right? One, it's not circular in the sense of like it's not. Obviously, you don't think it's definitionally circular, and two, I assume you only think it's like explanatorily circular. But the explanatory circularity is only rooted in just some description we're giving of these organisms, right? Obviously, I think the story ends at just the austere description of the organisms themselves, right? The fact that the organism has eyes means that it has the capacity. Well, it has eyes in the right like brain faculties means it has the capacity to discriminate red things from blue things, etc. So, like, look, now what you might be inclined to say is like, look, don't find that satisfactory, right? Because my story that I'm going to tell you is going to tell you why this set of descriptions actually leads to these mental facts as opposed to some other set of descriptions. But remember what I said earlier.
So you're just saying like the buck stops with biology.
That there is to the story is just these set of descriptions at the end.
Hello?
Oh, sorry. I think all that there is to the story was the descriptions in the end.
Well, I feel like.
By the way.
Huh?
Am I cutting off, by the way?
You're cutting the fuck off for me. It's weird. I don't know if I'm lagging or some shit. But saying it has eyes, right? Go ahead.
Well, I'm like sorry, I'm just asking if I had a poll to like see if I'm cutting out consistently.
No, because like for me, my internet's like really dog shit. So like for me,
okay.
I might be cutting out. But to quickly address what you said, and what's good, Apollo, saying it has eyes, therefore can discriminate, I feel like that's just causal and not semantic. So having eyes explains how an organism detects differences, but not how the detection becomes about something, how it acquires intentionality or semantic significance in the same way I'm talking about. So when you talk about causal discrimination, it's not the same.
I addressed this in the prior point. The way I addressed this, right, was merely saying at this point you're assuming that there's something over and above the descriptions that we were giving here.
Yeah, because when you talk, so in biology, right, it's fine to bottom out in primitives like DNA replicates because it chemically is structured to do so. Like, but in the philosophy of the mind, the explandum, the meaning, the normativity, and the intentionality, I think is supposed to be conceptually richer than its biological base. Like, if your explanation stops with the organism just has meaning, you haven't shown that the meaning would equal the biological functioning, so you only assert it. And I feel like that's like a category mistake. Look. Like when you're using.
Remember what it has meaning in virtue of.
Right? Yeah, I don't feel like the biological description embeds, but it doesn't generate normativity. Like that's what I feel like.
Well, look. Like, look. And I remember what it had. Remember what it had it in virtue of, right? With the virtue of relation, because of here. What the meaning where its meaning came from was the particular abilities that the organism could express, right? In these times, or specifically, I should probably state that they're speaking that these abilities are expressible, right? I mean, like I don't know what it means, not expressible, but specifically these abilities.
All right.
Yeah, these organisms can express, right? Now, look, if Now, look, if you're saying like, look,
You know,
by
everything, bro.
meaning, I also mean that it's specifically like it's gonna have like some representational picture, like it's gonna have to represent like the actual facts or be about things in the world. Then I probably just deny that type of representational picture of meaning that you were giving in the first place.
Why? Hello?
Hello, am I cutting out again?
No, it's just for me, but I don't know if it's like for other people. Probably just for me.
I thought I was cutting out. Anyway, but look, I was just
Yeah.
saying that I was just denying the representational picture of meaning for that to be a problem in the first place.
I see. Yeah, I feel like relational capacity, like when you deny the representation, it raises the distinction between causation and content. I think you're right that the organisms have abilities like they can orient, react, express, discriminate, but those relational abilities only explain the causal coupling and not the intentional content. So a thermostat, for example, that can express a relation temperature. It turns on when it's cold, but it doesn't mean it's cold. So it's just a relational behavior, which is causally sensitive, not semantically directed. So,
Sellers.
yeah, why is he precogging my shit? Yeah.
Yeah.
So if it's yeah, so like so if this meaning is just like what the organisms can express in the relation to the world, then thermostats, sunflowers, and even viruses will count as meaningful systems, and that dilutes meaning into mere causal correlation, eliminating the very notion of aboutness that distinguishes semantic from mechanical relations.
The thermostat example.
But another thing, because you already know that one, I wanted to say two more things I wanted to say. When you say the virtue of relation, I feel like that move collapses the distinction between significance and signaling. Sorry. So all I'm saying here is that the relational ability shows that something matters functionally to the organism, but that's significance and not meaning. And when I'm talking about the meaning here, that implies a content that can be correct or incorrect or true or false. So an organism can have like significance laden relations, maybe food matters, danger matters, or some shit like that, without those relations representing anything as true or false. And if you deny representation entirely, right, then you can no longer distinguish between the organism maybe mistakenly treats something as food and the organism or some shit correctly identifies as food. So I feel like without representation, there's no criterion for error, and so there would be no genuine semantics. So you would get biological coping, but not epistemic understanding. And when you deny the representation, that undercuts the normativity. You said earlier that mental facts are normative, that judgments have correctness conditions. But if you now deny representation, then you trivially abandon any framework that could support correctness at all. Because normative assessment requires a contrast between what is the case and what the system takes to be the case. So to me, I feel like without the representational structure, I feel like that distinction collapses. So if you were to go with that move to deny the representation I'm invoking here, that is to eliminate the very normativity your position is aimed to preserve.
Yeah, okay. So like let's primarily talk about the thermostat example, right? Because I think this is like the general gist. So one, we're talking about the thermostat example, and then I will address the problem of contrast and relation to representation.
Okay, right. Just to clarify, I have like 5 to 10 minutes left before I have to go to the hospital.
I guess this will be the final response. So in cases like the thermostat example, you're specifically saying, look, thermostats have these like belief like characteristics, right? They respond and react to particular like a certain type of sense. They give you a particular type of sensory report, right? That it's I don't know. We can say that it's like 40 degrees outside or something like that, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, specifically, right? When we have beliefs, right? Beliefs are something that are obviously, in my view, necessarily normative. And then this would eventually go on to, then this is me coupling it with the second problem, right, that you were saying. This problem is also coupled with the second problem, which is how exactly can an anti-representationalist theory be normative, right? Well, look, anti-representationalist theory is going to be normative, and this is probably where my position starts to sound crazy, right? But I think it's a warranted when we actually kind of when organisms start incorporating themselves into a form of life, or you can say they adopt a second nature, right? Mm-hmm. So when nature then participate in some game of giving and supplying reasons to other organisms, right? Then their actual capacities become normative. Now, why is this the case? Well, remember back in the thermostat, scenario, and the thermostat scenario, right? They're in a form of life, as far as we know. They are consequences of a form of life. They afford us certain things in our perception, but they don't, participate in a game of giving and asking for reasons. They might give reasons to us, but they don't necessarily ask us for particular reasons. I mean, there obviously is something to be said about thermostats being an extension of our capacities, right? But they're not anything over or above, right? Those things. But in cases of us, right, us as humans, at least with cognitive capacities, right, we have the capacity to give and ask for reasons with other individuals. Now, obviously, this would show how eventually this, becomes normative in the sense that you were talking about here, in the sense that we were different than thermostats. Now, there is a final thing to be said, right? Normativity requires a necessary contrast, right? And representation here obviously is meant to be like some type of mirror of the world. Well, look, remember what we're replacing representation with. We're not replacing representation with just a broad denial of representation, but with an actual positive theory, and not being some type of strongly inferentialist picture. To be a concept is necessarily to have its place within a web of concepts. So if you necessarily have that place in your kind of like whole web, or you can say like your structure of concepts, right? Then the picture is actually given of how they can be normative. They're necessarily contrasted with other concepts in terms of how they're defined.
All right. This will be my last response to that dip. So it seems like to me that you're saying that thermostats are normative because they don't participate in the form of life, like they don't engage in the game of giving and asking for questions, and humans doing shit like that.
Yeah, reasons, or you can.
Okay, so to give a rough response to everything you said before I have to go.
The Wittgensteinian sense, right?
Yeah. So the game of reasons, like for me, like that already presupposes a representational content. So to give a reason for a claim is to offer something that stands as evidence or justification for how those things are. But that for a relation is representational. So it links the thought to the world and not just the thought to the thought. So even if inferential roles explain how the concepts relate within the web, the correctness of those inferences depends on whether they track the worlds. So if the entire web of reason could float free of the world with no representational constraint, like normativity would collapse into mere consistency and the system of internal harmony. But you would have an inferential coherence and not truth or correctness. And so for that, I'd probably just say that inferentialism cannot replace the representation. It just presupposes it as like a background that makes correctness possible. And then I feel like when you appeal to forms of life, I feel like that just shifts the problem rather than solving it, given the analogy. So saying that only beings with a form of life can be normative explains how, not how, but who can play the game, but not why the game's moves count as right or wrong. Maybe like the social participation that explains the distribution of norms and not their authority. Like we can describe maybe a community's inferential practices, maybe Eric having a whole bunch of dick riders even though he's terrible. But the question remains, why are some inferences better or truer than others, right? If you say because that's how the form of life operates, then the normativity collapses into sociological regularity, and then I feel like someone can make the case that the very thing you wanted to transcend, oh my god, that was so fucking bad. It becomes descriptive again. And for the other thing you said, I would probably say that normativity requires more than just inferential embedding. I would say that would require truth conditions, like maybe in the purely inferential model, the meaning of a concept is determined by its relations to other concepts, right? But the normativity involves evaluating those relations in light of what they're supposed to capture, like maybe i.e. How things actually are. And I feel like without those truth conditions, the difference between maybe valid reasoning, maybe that Tron like beating and being way better than Eric, and maybe collective illusion disappears. Maybe Eric being a better debater than Tron. Like for example, another example, because I'm done dictating, a community could have like an internally coherent inferential rules that say all crows are divine or some shit like that. And the web might be consistent, but it's false. And to call it false, you must appeal to representational content that the world contains no divine crows. So I feel like someone can make the case that the inferential normativity alone is probably insufficient. And another thing you said normativity requires a necessary contrast, maybe because it becomes a mirror of the world. But that's precisely the representational relation, which is a contrast between how the world.
That's what I said.
Oh, that's not sorry.
That was something that you said, right? And I was specifically.
Oh, yo. So I'm lost. Okay, for that
That
part.
was something that you said.
So you were using that as a counterexample to me. But anyways, besides that small little retardedness there, I feel like the inferentialism that you're trying to evoke. I would just say.
Well, look, I already have a response, but since you have to go, right?
Oh yeah. So let me just fucking speed this shit up. I mean, we've been talking a lot. I'm trying to get clear on the view. I feel like to distinguish between good and bad inference, and you would need something beyond the web itself, like a standard of correctness. But if you deny representational constraint, um, then there's nothing external to the web to ground that distinction. And I feel like your framework, I feel like it becomes self-referentially not closed. Like it can explain internal coherence, but I feel like we're not genuine normativity. So I feel like the moment you introduce contrast within the world, right, with the world, I feel like you've conceived that inferential norms must answer to your representational content. And when you talk about the second nature, I feel like that explains the accusation, but not the ontology. So when someone says, or you say humans incorporate themselves,
I agree with the concern you're giving. So the concern you're giving is something along the lines of, is something along the lines of this. It's basically the same as McDowell's concern, which is that, look, if we just merely kind of talk about our own solipsistic picture or bubble, inferential web, right? Then we're all, then I guess you could say, sorry. Anyway, if we're really talking about our own solipsistic picture or web, right? Then we're basically, we just kind of committed ourselves to like a form of epistemic like solipsism, right? Metaphysical solipsism as well.
We're saying that like
there's no requirement for them to be true as it represents the
Wait, why is this guy talking? Hold on. Hello?
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna ask you what was the topic you guys were debating about.
We're just discussing the philosophy of mine. Is my view.
Philosophy. Okay,
but yeah, Fleur, I think that was a good conversation. I have to go right now. I'm getting yelled at